Hey guys, welcome back for more chapters of Island of Blue Dolphins. If you remember, last time we left off, Karana's brother Ramo had been killed by the wild dogs, and Karana waited as long as she could, but she gave up. She gave up on anybody coming back around, so she decided to get in one of the old boats herself and try to find a new island, but she was unsuccessful and decided to turn back around after her boat sprung a leak. So she's just now got back to the island of the Blue Dolphins. So here's chapter 11. I awakened by the waves dragging at my feet. Night had come, but being too tired to leave the sandspit, I crawled to a higher place where I would be safe from the tide, and again went to sleep. In the morning, I found the canoe a short distance away. I took the baskets, my spear, and the bow and arrows, and turned the canoe over so that the tides could not take it out to sea. I then climbed to the headland where I had lived before. I felt as if I'd been gone a long time as I stood there looking down from the high rock. I was happy to be home. Everything that I saw, the otter playing in the kelp, the rings of foam around the rocks that guarded the harbor, the gulls flying, the tides moving past the sandspit, filled me with happiness. I was surprised that I felt this way, for it was only a short time ago that I had stood on this same rock, and I felt that I could not bear to live here another day. I looked out at the blue water, stretching away, and all the fear I had felt during the time of the voyage came back to me. On the morning I first sighted the island, and it had seemed like a great fish sunning itself, I thought that someday I would make the canoe over and go out once more to look for the country that lay beyond the oceans. Now I knew that I would never go again. The island of the Blue Dolphins was my home. I had no other. It would be my home until the white men returned in their ship. But even if they came soon, before next summer, I could not live without a roof or a place to store my food. I would have to build a house, but where? That night I slept on the rock, and the next day I began to search. The morning was clear, but to the north banks of the clouds hung low. Before long, they would move in across the island, and behind them, many other storms were waiting. I had no time to waste. I needed a place that was sheltered from the wind, not too far from Coral Cove, and close to a good spring. There were two such places on the island, one on the headland and the other less than a league to the west. The headland seemed to be the more favorable of the two, but since I had not been to the other for a long time, I decided to go there and make certain. The first thing that I found, which I had forgotten, was that this place was near the wild dog's lair. As soon as I drew near to it, the leader came to the opening of the cave and watched me with his yellow eyes. If I built a hut here, I would first have to kill him and his pack. I planned to do this anyway, but it would take much time. The spring was better than the one near the headland, being less brackish and having a steadier flow of water. Besides, it was much easier to reach, since it came from the side of a hill and not from a ravine as the other one did. It was also close to the cliff and a ridge of rocks which would shelter my house. The rocks were not so high as those on the headland, and therefore would give me less protection from the wind. Yet they were high enough, and from them I could see the north coast and Coral Cove. The next thing that made me decide on the place to build my house was the sea elephants. The cliffs here fell away easily to a wide shelf that was partly covered when the tide came in. It was a good place for sea elephants because they could crawl halfway up the cliff if the day was stormy. On fair days, they could fish among the pools or lie on the rocks. The bull is very large and often weighs as much as 30 men. The cows are much smaller, but they make more noise than the bulls, screaming and barking through the whole day and sometimes at night. The babies are noisy too. On this morning, the tide was low, and most of the animals were far out, just hundreds of specks against the waves, yet the noise they made was deafening. I stayed there the rest of the day looking around, and that night at dawn, when the clamor started again, I left and went back to the headland. There was another place to the south where I could have built my house, near the destroyed village of Galsad. But I did not want to go there, because it would remind me of the people who were gone. Also, the wind blew strong in this place, blowing against the dunes which cover the middle part of the island, so that most of the time sand is moving everywhere. Rain fell that night and lasted for 2 days. I made a shelter of brush at the foot of the rock, which kept off some of the water, and I ate the food I had stored in the basket. I could not build a fire because of the rain, and I was very cold. On the third day, the rain ceased, and I went out to look for things which I would need in building the house. I likewise needed poles for a fence. I would soon kill the wild dogs, but there were many small red foxes on the island. They were so numerous that I could never hope to get rid of them, either by traps or with arrows. They were clever thieves, and nothing I stored would be safe until I had built a fence. The morning was fresh from the rain. The smell of the tide pools was strong. Sweet odors came from the wild grasses in the ravines, and from the sand plants and the dunes. I sang as I went down to the trail to the beach, and along the beach to the sandspit. I felt that the day was an omen of good fortune. It was a good day to begin my new home. Chapter 12. Many years before, 2 whales had washed up on the sandspit. Most of the bones had been taken away to make ornaments, but ribs were still there, half buried in the sand. These I used in making the fence. One by one, I dug them up and I carried them to the headland. They were long and curved, and when I had scooped out holes and set them in the earth, they stood taller than I did. I put the ribs together with their edges almost touching, and standing so that they curved outward, which made them impossible to climb. Between them I wove many strands of bull kelp, which shrinks as it dries and pulls very tight. I would have used seal sinew to bind the ribs together, but this is stronger than kelp, and the wild animals don't like it, but wild animals like it, and soon would have gnawed the fence down. Much time went into its building. It would have taken me longer, except the rock made one end of the fence and part of a side. For a place to go in and out, I dug a hole under the fence, just wide enough and deep enough to crawl through. The bottom and sides I lined with stones. On the outside, I covered the hole with a mat woven of brush to shed the rain, and on the inside with a flat rock, which I was strong enough to move. I was able to take 8 steps between the sides of the fence, which gave me all the room I would need to store things that I gathered and wished to protect. I built the fence first because it was too cold to sleep on the rock, and I did not like to sleep in the shelter I had made until I was safe from the wild dogs. The house took longer to build than the fence because it rained many days and because the woods, which I needed, was scarce. There was a legend among our people that the island had once been covered with tall trees. This was a long time ago, at the beginning of the world, when Tumiyoet and Mukat ruled. The 2 gods quarreled about many things. Tumiyoet wished people to die, but Mukat did not. Tumiyoet angrily went down to another world, under this world, taking his belongings with him, so people die because he did. In that time, there were tall trees, but now there were only a few in the ravines, and they were small and crooked. It was very hard to find one that would make a good pole. I searched many days, going out early in the morning and coming back at night, before I found enough for the house. I used the rock for the back of the house, and the front I left open since the wind did not blow from this direction. The poles I made of equal length, using fire to cut them as well as a stone knife, which caused me such difficulty because I had never made such a tool before. There were 4 poles on each side, set in the earth, and twice that many for the roof. These I bound together with sinew covered with female kelp, which had broad leaves. The winter was half over before I finished the house, but I slept there every night, and I felt secure because of the strong fence. The foxes came when I was cooking my food and stood outside gazing through the cracks. And the wild dogs also came, gnawing at the whale ribs, growling because they could not get in. I shot 2 of them, but not the leader. While I was building the fence and the house, I ate shellfish and perch, which I cooked on a flat rock. Afterwards, I made 2 utensils. Along the shore, there were stones that the sea had worn smooth. Most of them were round, but I found 2 with hollow places in the center, which I deepened and broadened by rubbing them with sand. Using these to cook in, I saved the juices of the fish, which are good and were wasted before. For cooking seeds and roots, I wove a tight basket of fine reeds, which was easy because I had learned how to do it from my sister, Eulape. After the basket had dried in the sun, I gathered lumps of pitch on the shore, softened them over the fire, and rubbed them on the inside of the basket so that it would hold water. By heating small stones and dropping them into a mixture of water and seeds in the basket, I could make gruel. I made a place for fire in the floor of my house, hollowing it out and lining it with rocks. In the village at Galasat, we made new fires every night, but now I made one fire, which I covered with ashes when I went to bed. The next night, I would remove the ashes and blow on the embers. In this way, I saved myself much work. There were many gray mice on the island, and now that I had food to keep from one meal to the other, I needed a safe place to put it. On the face of the rock, which was the back wall of my house, were several cracks as high as my shoulder. These I cut out and smoothed to make shelves where I would store my food, and the mice could not reach it. By the time winter was over and grass began to show green on the hills, my house was comfortable. I was sheltered from the wind and rain and prowling animals. I could cook anything I wished to eat. Everything I wanted was there at hand. It was now time to make plans for getting rid of the wild dogs which had killed my brother and would kill me should they ever come upon me unarmed. I needed another and heavier spear, also a larger bow and sharper arrows. To collect the material for these weapons, I searched the whole island, taking many suns to do it, and this left only the nights to work on them. Since I could not see well by the dim fire I used for cooking, I made lamps of the dried bodies of little fish, which were called sai-sai. The sai-sai is the color of silver and not much bigger than a finger. On nights when the moon shines full, these little fish come swimming out of the sea in schools so thick that you can almost walk on them. They come with the waves, and they twist and turn on the sand as if they were dancing. I caught many basketfuls of sai-sai, and I put them out in the sun, hung up by their tails from the poles of the roof. They made much odor, but burned with a very clear light. I made the bow and arrows first, and was pleased when I tried them that I could shoot farther and much straighter than I had before. The spear I left to the last. I wondered as I smoothed and shaped the long handle and fitted a stone collar around the end, both to give the spear weight and to hold the spear point. If I could make this point the way the men of our tribe did, from the tooth of a sea elephant. Many nights I thought about it, wondering how I could possibly kill one of those great beasts. I could not use a net of kelp, because that needed the strength of several men. Nor could I remember that a bull elephant had ever been killed with an arrow or with a spear. Only after they had been caught in a net were they killed, and then with a club. We killed many cows for their oil, using spears, but the teeth were not large. How could I do this? I did not know, yet the more I thought about it, the greater was my determination to try, for there was nothing to be found on the island that made such good spear points as the tusk-like teeth of the bull sea elephant. Chapter 13. I did not sleep much the night before I went to the place of the sea elephants. I thought again about the law that forbade women to make weapons. I wondered if my arrows would go straight, and if they did, would they pierce the animal's tough hide? What if one of the bulls turned on me? What if I were injured and then had to fight the wild dogs as I dragged myself homeward? I thought about these things most of the night, but with the sun I was up and on my way to the place where the sea elephants lived. When I reached the cliff, the animals had left the reef and gathered along the shore. Like gray boulders, the bulls sat on the pebbly slope. Below them, cows and their babies played in the waves. Perhaps it's not right to speak of a young sea elephant as a baby, for they are as large as a man, but they're still babies in many ways. They follow their mothers around, waddling along on their flippers like children learning to walk, making crying sounds. And they make sounds of pleasure that only the young can make. And before they will leave the shore and learn to swim, their mothers have to push them into the sea, which is often difficult to do because of their size. Some distance separated the bulls from each other, for they are bad-tempered, very jealous by nature, and quick to fight over anything that displeases them. There were 6 of them below me on the slope, each sitting alone like a great chief, watching his herd of cows and babies. The cow has a smooth body and a face that looks much like that of a mouse, with a sharp-pointed nose and whiskers. But the bull is different. His nose has a large hump on it, which hangs down over his mouth. His skin is rough and looks like wet earth that has dried in the sun and cracked. He is an ugly animal. From the top of the cliff, I looked down at each of the sea elephants and tried to choose the smallest of the 6. They were all the same size, save one, which was the farthest from me and partly hidden by a rock. He was about half as large as the others, a young bull. Since no cows were playing among the waves in front of him, I knew that he did not have a herd of his own, and for that reason would not be so wary or quickly angered. Quietly, I let myself down over the edge of the cliff. To reach him, I had to pass behind the others, being careful not to alarm them. They fear nothing, and they would not move if they saw me, but it was better, I thought, not to push them on their guard. I carried my new bow, which was almost as tall as I was, and 5 arrows. The path was rough and covered with small stones. I took pains not to send them tumbling down the slope. I was also careful not to be seen by the cows, which get alarmed easily and would have warned the rest of the herd with their cries. I crawled behind a big rock near the young bull. I then got to my feet and fitted an arrow to the bow, although I suddenly remembered my father's warning that because I was a woman, the bow would break. The sun was far in the west, but luckily my shadow fell away from the young bull. The distance between us was short, and his back was turned squarely towards me. Still, I did not know where to place the first arrow, whether in his shoulders or in his head. The skin of the sea elephant is rough, yet very thin, but beneath it are thick layers of fat, and though his body is large, his head is small and makes a poor target. While I stood there behind the rock, not knowing what to do, again aware of my father's warning that a bow in the hands of a woman would always break in times of danger, the animal began to move toward the shore. At first, I thought that by some chance he had heard me. I soon saw that he was on his way towards the cows that belonged to the old bull sitting nearby. The sea elephants move fast in spite of his size, waddling along on his great flippers, which he uses like hands. The bull was nearing the water. I let the arrow go, and it went straight. At the last instant, he changed direction, and though the bow did not break, the arrow passed harmlessly to one side. I had failed to notice that the old bull was moving down the slope until I heard stones grating against each other. Quickly he overtook his rival, and with a single thrust of his shoulders overturned him. The young bull stood as high as a tall man, and was twice that length. Yet, from the force of the blow, he rolled onto the water and lay there stunned. The old bull bore down on him, swinging his head and bellowing so loud it echoed against the cliffs. The herd of cows and calves, who were lying in the waves and scratching their backs with their flippers, stopped to watch the battle. 2 of the cows were in the bull's paths as he waddled toward his rival, but he went over to them as if they were small stones. Using his tusk-like teeth, he ripped a long gash in the young bull's side. The young bull raised himself, and as he turned, his small eyes shone fiercely red. When the old bull slashed at him again, he struck first and sunk his teeth into the other's neck. He did not let go, and the 2 rolled over in the waves, slashing water high as in the air. The cows had scattered by now, but the other bulls still sat quietly on the slope. The 2 fighters paused, getting ready for a new attack. It was a good chance to send an arrow into the young bull, which lay on its back with his teeth still grasping the other's neck. But I had hoped that he would win the battle, and I stood there and I did not move. The old bull had many deep scars on his head and shoulders from the battles that he had fought before. Suddenly, he lashed out with his tail, trying to loose the hold on his neck, and struck the side of a rock. With his tail against the rock, he flung his body out of the water and thus broke away. He came quickly up the slope, his great mouth open. The young bull closed behind him. He came toward me, and in haste to get out of his way, not knowing whether he was bent on attacking me, I stepped back. In doing so, I tripped over a stone and fell to my knees. I felt a sharp pain in my leg, but was quickly up. By this time, the old bull had whirled around and turned upon his pursuer so fast that the young bull was taken by surprise. Again, the young bull's flank was ripped deep, and again, the force of the blow threw him backward into the water. The waves grew redder from his blood, but this time he rolled over and was waiting for the charge. He met the old bull with his shoulder. The sound was like rocks crashing together. Once more, the young bull caught the other's throat, and together they disappeared beneath a wave. When they came up, they were still locked together. The sun had gone down, and it was so dark that I could no longer see clearly. My leg had now begun to hurt. Since I had a very long way to go, I left them. I could hear their bellowing as I went up the cliff and for a long time afterwards. Chapter 14. My leg hurt so much by the time I had reached the house that it was hard for me to crawl under the fence and move aside the heavy rock. For 5 suns I could not go out because my leg had swollen so badly. I had no herbs with which to treat it. I had enough food to eat, but on the 3rd day the water in the basket ran low. 2 days later the basket was empty. It was then necessary for me to go to the spring in the ravine. I started out when the sun rose. I took with me shellfish to eat. also my spear and my bow and arrows. I went very slowly, for I had to crawl on my hands and knees, carrying the food tied to my back and dragging the weapons. There was a short way to the spring, but it was over many rocks which I could not climb, so I had to take a longer way through the brush. I reached the ravine when the sun was overhead. The spring was not far off, and I rested there, though I was very thirsty, cutting a lobe from a cactus bush to chew on. While I was resting there, sucking the juice from the cactus, I saw the big gray dog, the leader of the wild pack, in the brush above me. His head was down, and he was moving slowly, sniffing the tracks that I had made. He saw me soon after I saw him and stopped. Behind him was the rest of the pack, trotting along one after the other. The pack stopped too. I took up my bow and I fitted an arrow, but as I did this, the big dog faded away into the brush and was quickly followed by the others. In the time of one breath, they were gone. There was nothing to aim my arrow at. It was as if they had not been there at all. I listened. They were moving so silently that I could not hear their steps, but I was sure that they would try to surround me. Slowly, I crawled on, stopping to listen, to glance back, to measure the distance between me and the spring. My leg hurt. I left my bow and arrows behind as I went on, for the brush had gotten so heavy that I could not use them. In one hand, I dragged my spear. I came to the spring. It flowed out of a crack in the rock, and the rock rose high on the three sides of it. The wild dogs could not attack me from any of these directions, so I lay on the earth and I drank, watching the ravine below me. I drank for a long time, and I filled my basket, and then, feeling better, crawled towards the mouth of the cave. A ledge of black rock ran out above it. Some low bushes grew there, and among them, with just his head showing, stood the big gray dog. He did not move, but his yellow eyes followed me, turning slowly as I drew near the cave. Another head showed behind him, and another. They were too far away for me to reach with my spear. Suddenly, I saw brush moving on the opposite bank of the ravine. The pack had split up and were waiting on both sides of the ravine for me to pass them. The cave was now in front of me. I crawled to the mouth and into it. Above me, I could hear feet running and the cracking of brush, which was followed by silence. I was safe. I knew the wild dogs would come back, and they did as night fell, stalking around in the brush until morning, but not venturing close. Although the mouth of the cave was small, once you were inside, it spread out and you could stand up. Water dropped from the roof, and the cave was cold without a fire. But here I stayed for 6 suns until my leg was well, crawling out only once to fetch water from the spring. While I was living there, I decided that I would make the cave into another house where I could stay should I get sick or get hurt. And this I did as soon as I was strong and I could walk. The cave went far back into the hill around many turns, but I needed only that part which lay near the opening and which the sun could reach during most of the day. A long time before this, my ancestors had used this cave, why I do not know, and along the walls on each side they had cut figures in the stone. There were figures of pelicans floating in the water and flying, of dolphins, whales, sea elephants, gulls, ravens, dogs, and foxes. Near the opening of the cave, they had also cut 2 deep basins in the stone, which I decided to use for storing water, since they held much more than the baskets. I made shelves in the side of the rock, as I had done in the other house, and I gathered shellfish and seeds to store there. I also gathered herbs from the hill above the spring in case I should need them. The bow and arrows I had first made I likewise took to the cave. At last, after I had made a good bed of seaweed and collected dry wood for my fires, I closed the opening with stones, except for a small hole at the top which I could crawl through. All this I did, thinking of the days that I had been sick and without water. It was hard work, much of it a man's work, but not until I was finished did I go back to the place where the sea elephants lived. The tide was low when I reached it. Far up on the slope lay the body of the old bull. Gulls had picked his bones clean, but I found what I had come for. Some of the teeth were as long as my hand and half of its width. They were curved at the tops, and some were broken. But when I had ground the best of them down with sand, I had for my work 4 good spear points, broad at the bottom and very sharp at the ends. I made 2 more spears from these points, and at last was ready to go to the cave of the wild dogs. All right, guys, our next chapter is chapter 15. This is the last chapter that we'll be reading for this one. There had been wild dogs on the island of the Blue Dolphins as long as I can remember, but after the Aleuts had slain most of the men of our tribe, and their dogs had left to join the others, the pack became much bolder. It spent the nights running through the village, and during the day was never far off. It was then that we made plans to get rid of them, but the ship came and everyone left Galasat. I am sure that the pack grew bolder because of their leader, the big one with the thick fur around his neck and the yellow eyes. I'd never seen this dog before the Aleuts came, and no one else had, so he must have come with them and been left behind when they sailed away. He was a much larger dog than any of ours, which, besides having short hair and brown eyes, I was sure that he was an Aleut dog. Already, I had killed 5 of the pack, but there were many left, more than in the beginning, for some had been born in the meantime. The young dogs were even wilder than the old ones. I first went to the hill near the cave when the pack was away, and collected armloads of brush, which I placed near the mouth of their lair. Then I waited until the pack was in the cave. It went there early in the morning to sleep after it had spent the night prowling. I took with me the big bow and 5 arrows and 2 of the spears. I went quietly, circling around the mouth of the cave, and came up to it from the side. There I left all my weapons except 1 spear. I set fire to the brush and pushed it into the cave. If the wild dogs heard me, there was no sound from them. Nearby was a ledge of rock, which I climbed, taking my weapons with me. The fire burned high. Some of the smoke trailed out over the hill, but much of it stayed in the cave. Soon the pack would have to leave. I did not hope to kill more than 5 of them because I had only that many arrows. But if the leader was one of the 5, I would be satisfied. It might be wiser if I waited and saved all my arrows for him, and this I decided to do. None of the dogs appeared before the fire died, and then 3 ran out and away. 7 more followed, and a long time afterwards a like number. There were many more still left in the cave. The leader came next. Unlike the others, he did not run away. He jumped over the ashes and he stood at the mouth of the cave, sniffing the air. I was so close to him that I could see his nose quivering, but he did not see me until I raised my bow. Fortunately, I did not frighten him. He stood facing me, his front legs spread as if he were ready to spring. His yellow eyes narrowed to slits. The arrow struck him in the chest. He turned away from me, took 1 step, and fell. I sent another arrow toward him, which went wide. At this time, 3 more dogs trotted out of the cave, and I used the last of my arrows and killed 2 of them. Carrying both of the spears, I climbed down from the ledge and went through the brush to the place where the leader had fallen. He was not there. While I had been shooting at the other dogs, he had gone. He could not have gone far because of his wound, but though I looked everywhere around the ledge where I had been standing and in front of the cave, I did not find him. I waited for a long time, then I went inside the cave. It was deep, but I could see clearly. Far back in a corner was the half-eaten carcass of a fox. Beside it was a black dog with 4 gray pups. One of the pups came slowly towards me, a round ball of fur that I could have held in my hand. I wanted to hold it, but his mother leaped to her feet and bared her teeth. I raised my spear as I backed out of the cave, yet I did not use it. The wounded leader was not there. Night was coming, and I left the cave, going along the foot of the hill that led to the cliff. I had not gotten far on this trail that the wild dogs used when I saw the broken shaft of an arrow. It had been gnawed off near the tip, and I knew that it was from the arrow which had wounded the leader. Farther on, I saw his tracks in the dust. They were uneven, as if he were traveling slowly. I followed them toward the cliff, but finally lost them in the darkness. The next day, and next, it rained, and I did not go to look for him. I spent those days making more arrows, and on the 3rd day, with these arrows and my spear, I went out along the trail the wild dogs had made, and from my house. There were no tracks after the rain, but I followed the trail to the pile of rocks where I had seen them before. On the far side of the rocks, I found the big gray dog. He had the broken arrow in his chest, and he was laying with one of his legs under him. He was about 10 paces from me, so I could see him clearly. I was sure that he was dead, but I lifted the spear and took good aim at him. Just as I was about to throw the spear, he raised his head a little from the earth and then let it drop. This surprised me greatly, and I stood there for a while, not knowing what to do, whether to use the spear or my bow. I was used to animals playing dead until they suddenly turned on you or ran away. The spear was the better of the two weapons at this distance, but I could not use it as well as the other, so I climbed onto the rocks where I could see him if he ran. I placed my feet carefully. I had a second arrow ready should I need it, but I fitted an arrow and pulled back the string, aiming at his head. Why I did not send the arrow I cannot say. I stood on the rock with the bow pulled back, and my hand would not let it go. The big dog lay there and did not move, and this may be the reason. If he had gotten up, I would have killed him. I stood there for a long time, looking down at him, and then I climbed off the rocks. He did not move when I went up to him, nor could I see him breathing until I was very close. The head of the arrow was in his chest, and the broken shaft was covered with his blood. The thick fur around his neck was matted from the rain. I do not think that he knew I was picking him up, for his body was limp, as if he were dead. He was very heavy, and the only way I could lift him was by kneeling and putting his legs around my shoulders. In this manner, stopping to rest when I was tired, I carried him to the headland. I could not get through the opening under the fence, so I cut the bindings and I lifted out 2 of the whale ribs, and thus took him into the house. He did not look at me or raise his head when I laid him on the floor, but his mouth was open and he was breathing. The arrow had a small point, which was fortunate, and came out easily, though it had gone deep. He did not move while I did this, nor afterwards as I cleaned the wound with a peeled stick from a coral bush. This bush has poisonous berries, yet its wood often heals wounds that nothing else will. I had not gathered food for many days, and the baskets were empty, so I left water for the dog, and after mending the fence, went down to the sea. I had no thought that he would live, and I did not care. All day I was among the rocks, gathering shellfish, and only once did I think of the wounded dog, my enemy, lying there in the house, and then to wonder why I had not killed him. He was still alive when I got back, though he had not moved from this place where I had left him. Again, I cleaned the wound with the coral twig. I then lifted his head, and I put water in his mouth, which he swallowed. This was the first time that he had looked at me since the time that I had found him on the trail. His eyes were sunken, and they looked out at me from far back in his head. Before I went to sleep, I gave him more water. In the morning, I left food for him when I was down to the sea, and when I came home, he had eaten it. He was lying in the corner watching me. While I made a fire and I cooked my supper, he watched me. His yellow eyes followed me wherever I moved. That night, I slept on the rock, for I was afraid of him. And at dawn, as I went out, I left the hole under the fence open so he could go. But he was there when I got back, lying in the sun with his head in his paws. I had speared 2 fish, which I cooked for my supper. Since he was very thin, I gave him one of them, and after he had eaten it, he came over and lay down by the fire, watching me with his yellow eyes that were very narrow and slanted up to the corners. 4 nights I slept on the rock, and every morning I left the hole under the fence open so that he could leave. Each day I speared a fish for him, and when I got home, he was always at the fence waiting for it. He would not take the fish from me, so I had to put it on the ground. Once I held out my hand to him, but at this he backed away, and he showed his teeth. On the 4th day, when I came back from the rocks early, he was not there at the fence waiting. A strange feeling came over me. Always before, when I returned, I had hoped that he would be gone, but now, as I crawled under the fence, I did not feel the same. I called out, "Dog, dog," for I had no other name for him. I ran towards the house calling it, and he was inside. He was just getting to his feet, stretching himself and yawning. He looked first at the fish I carried and then at me and moved his tail. That night I stayed in the house. Before I fell asleep, I thought of a name for him, for I could not call him Dog. The name that I thought of was Rontu, which means, in our language, fox eyes. Well, guys, that was a very unexpected ending of Chapter 15, and that does it for this chapter. Be sure to, of course, complete your quiz. Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye.